How do you view the social composition of the Aragalaya? Just to stick with the protests, I mean, the composition at GGG, for instance, is not the same as the composition, let's say, outside of the Western Province when they first started. They weren't even referred to as the Aragalaya, the farmers, the peasantry. When they started protesting, it wasn't that branding, everything wasn't there. But people perhaps underestimate how much of a broad composition there is overall. But how do you see, what are the fault lines? I mean, if you're trying to say, it is always easy, I think you mentioned this in a piece recently, where it's always easy when you have a very singular objective, get rid of Gotabaya. And then beyond that, when you try to sort of synthesize the objectives of various groups, it's a hit and a miss. So how do you see the Aragalaya and the national mood at the moment? Do you think people are just giving the government a chance? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, it just so happened that the grievances of all these social groups revolved around and centered on one person, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. For the farmers, it was the disastrous fertilizer policy. For the youth, it was, the destruction of their dreams and hopes, particularly because Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected by a huge youth electorate. I mean, huge youth base. He had a huge youth base. And ironically, these were probably the same youths who voted for Maithripala Sirisena. So they felt betrayed twice over. So they just turned their wrath on him. Then there were the IT professionals, the advertising guys, the industrialists, in the sense what little industrialists we have in this country, the importers, the exporters, the professionals, the three-wheel drivers. They were all pissed off, to use a regularly used word, because they were, I mean, a fuel crisis on the one hand, a plummeting rupee on the other.
Yes.
Their living conditions they took a hit, a severe hit. So all of them could get together because they could associate all these problems with one man, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. I didn't expect the protests to dissipate so quickly. I thought it would take at least a month or two. But then almost immediately on the 13th of July, when we had that huge controversy regarding the occupation of the parliament, we saw a lot of middle class groups within the Aragalaya come out and say, we are not with these groups. They actually stated that these groups, these radical groups, these socialist groups, they actually tarred them with the socialist brush in a condescending way. We are not with them, they are not with us, they never led this movement, we were at the front lines. So it's at this point that a sort of breach cropped up between the constitutionalist wing and the populist wing. Right. So there are those who say that there's no point talking about a constitutional solution to the crisis because this is not a government with enough legitimacy. You need legitimacy as well as legality. Then there are others who say stick to the letter and the spirit of the law, don't go beyond that, don't try to occupy buildings because we are done and we are through with that. So I mean, this cleavage proved to be fatal to the Aragalaya, or at least the first and second waves of the Aragalaya. The first was, of course, to get rid of Gotabaya, then it sort of, how shall I put it, subsided after Ranil Wickremesinghe became Prime Minister. Then the second wave again to get rid of him, that was the one that really pushed him out. And mind you, these two waves subsided and increased because they were faced with economic issues. Now, I don't know to what extent people would have gathered around and gone to the presidential secretariat if the fuel crisis didn't become so bad. I mean, it was so bad that the government just gave 2 weeks, no fuel, just stay at home.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have, I don't know whether the government was expecting people not to come because they would be forced to stay at home, but if so, they miscalculated badly because no matter what the distance, they just walked all the way. They were so angry.
Exactly.
So in Sri Lanka, when the middle classes get angry, they get really angry. But of course, like you hinted earlier, there were protests before the Aragalaya. There were protests way before the Aragalaya. There were protests in Rajapaksa heartlands, farmers, peasants, workers, three-wheel drivers. They all were there, but the branding, as you suggested, the branding of it as an Aragalaya, as an uprising of the people, could only come with the necessary, with social groups who could actually bring about that kind of branding. And the social groups that could bring about that kind of branding were, on the one hand, the middle classes who had the money and the capital,
Right.
And on the other hand, the IUSF, the FSP, those radical left groups that could actually bring about, that provide a radical cosmetic, so to speak, to the protests, so to speak. So these two groups got together for a very brief time, but once their main objective was achieved, we are obviously seeing cleavages right now. I mean, that's inevitable, but also, like I said earlier, I didn't expect those cleavages to surface so quickly.